man who was convicted of murdering his wife and 4 kids returned to the classroom today as defense attorneys try to keep Michael Wayne Jones off of death row.
TV 20's Taylor Simpson tells us who they brought to the witness stand in his defense.
Throughout the hearing, a few times Michael Wayne Jones balled up his hands and placed them over his eyes as the defense and the state asked questions to a neuropsychologist. Jones faces the death penalty after killing his wife and his 4 children. His defense attorneys brought a neuropsychologist to the stand to speak on his mental capability. The psychologist diagnosed Jones with PTSD due to being molested as a child. He says Jones is a low-functioning person who dropped out of school.
Michael had been sexually abused by a step-uncle. He was about 5 or 6, and this individual had gone to prison for molesting 2 of his daughters.
But the state disagreed, saying Jones was a well-functioning person after serving in the Navy and holding stable jobs and wasn't molested over a long period of time.
According to the Dell reports, the defendant told them that he was molested for several years, right?
I believe so.
That is very different than what he told you. The defendant told you, right?
Yes.
He told you he was touched 1 time.
Yes.
The jury trial continues next week as more witnesses will testify on behalf of the defense. In Ocala, Taylor Simpson, TV 20 News.